The discovery happened during Ronaldo's early morning run along the Manzanares River in Madrid on a foggy Tuesday in February, when he noticed what appeared to be a makeshift shelter constructed from cardboard boxes and plastic tarps under the Puente de Toledo. And as he slowed his pace to investigate what he initially thought might be an abandoned campsite, he realized that the shelter was occupied by a family who had been quietly living there for weeks without attracting attention from authorities or passers-by, who preferred not to acknowledge the presence of homeless people in areas where their visibility contradicted the image of prosperity and success that characterized Madrid's wealthier neighborhoods, where families with adequate housing rarely encountered evidence of the housing crisis that affected thousands of people who worked but still couldn't afford rent in a city where property values had increased faster than wages for most workers. The family consisted of Diego, a 42-year-old construction worker who had been unemployed for 8 months after a workplace injury had prevented him from continuing the physical labor that had supported his family for 15 years. His wife, Carmen, who worked part-time as a house cleaner, but whose income was insufficient to cover rent and basic expenses for their family, and their 2 children, 10-year-old Sofia and 7-year-old Miguel, who had been attending school sporadically because they lacked permanent addresses and proper clothing that would allow them to blend in with classmates, whose stable housing situations provided the foundation for educational success that was becoming increasingly difficult to achieve when basic survival needs consumed most of their family's time and energy. Diego's injury had occurred when scaffolding collapsed at a construction site where safety regulations were poorly enforced and workers' compensation was limited to minimal medical coverage that didn't include rehabilitation services or temporary disability payments that could have allowed him to recover properly while maintaining his family's housing and financial stability. And his attempts to find alternative employment had been unsuccessful because his injury prevented him from performing the physical labor that constituted most available work for someone with his educational background and skill set, while office jobs that might have been suitable for his physical limitations required credentials and experience that he lacked due to economic circumstances that had forced him to begin working immediately after completing basic education, rather than pursuing advanced training that might have provided more career flexibility. Carmen's part-time cleaning work was unreliable and poorly paid, with employers who paid below minimum wage and provided no benefits or job security, and her schedule was constantly changing based on clients' needs rather than her family's requirements, making it impossible to plan for regular expenses or to seek additional employment that might conflict with existing commitments. And the stress of trying to support her family while maintaining their dignity and her children's education had taken a significant toll on her physical and mental health that was compounded by the constant anxiety of not knowing where they would sleep each night, or whether they would be discovered and forced to move to a new location that might be less safe or accessible to the services they needed. The children's adaptation to homelessness was both heartbreaking and inspiring, with Sofia taking on responsibilities for caring for her younger brother that should have belonged to adults, while Miguel tried to maintain the cheerful disposition that had characterized his personality before their family's circumstances had changed so dramatically. And both children had learned to be quiet and invisible in public spaces, where their presence might attract unwanted attention from authorities who could separate them from their parents or force their family to move to locations that were more dangerous or further from the schools and services that provided some stability in lives that had been disrupted by economic forces beyond their control or understanding. Ronaldo's initial approach was cautious and respectful, understanding that homeless families were often wary of strangers whose intentions might not be benevolent and whose intervention could sometimes create more problems than solutions. And when he introduced himself and asked if the family needed assistance, their response was initially guarded, because they had learned to be suspicious of people who claimed to want to help, but whose assistance often came with conditions or expectations that could compromise their autonomy or separate family members who were determined to stay together despite circumstances that tested their resilience and mutual commitment on a daily basis. The conversation that followed revealed the complexity of their situation and the systematic barriers that prevented families like theirs from accessing housing assistance, social services, and employment opportunities that were theoretically available but practically inaccessible due to bureaucratic requirements, waiting lists, and eligibility criteria that excluded people whose circumstances were too unstable to meet documentation requirements, or who lacked permanent addresses that were necessary for applying for services that were designed to help homeless people, but were administered in ways that made access difficult for people whose homelessness prevented them from maintaining the organizational stability that service applications required. Diego's pride and dignity were evident in his reluctance to accept charity and his emphasis on wanting work rather than handouts. But his explanation of his failed job search revealed the catch-22 situations that trapped many unemployed workers who needed addresses to apply for jobs, but needed jobs to afford addresses, who needed professional clothing and transportation to interview for positions, but lacked resources to purchase these necessities, and who faced discrimination from employers who viewed homelessness as evidence of personal failure rather than systematic economic problems that could affect anyone whose employment was eliminated by injury, illness, business closure, or economic downturns that displaced entire industries. Carmen's perspective focused on her children's needs and her determination to ensure that their education continued despite their unstable housing situation, and her description of the challenges involved in maintaining school attendance without permanent addresses, appropriate clothing, or reliable transportation revealed how homelessness affected every aspect of family life, including children's academic performance, social development, and mental health, that were suffering from the stress and uncertainty of not knowing where they would sleep each night, or whether they would be safe from weather, crime, or authorities who might separate them from their parents. The immediate assistance that Ronaldo provided included hotel accommodation for the family, while longer-term solutions were developed. But more importantly, he spent time understanding their specific needs and circumstances rather than making assumptions about what type of help would be most beneficial. And this careful approach revealed that different homeless families face different challenges that required individualized responses rather than generic assistance programs that might address some needs while ignoring others that were equally important for helping families achieve stability and independence that could be sustained over time, rather than just temporarily relieving immediate crises. The employment assistance that emerged from Ronaldo's intervention included not just help finding work for Diego that accommodated his physical limitations, but also support for Carmen in developing skills and credentials that could lead to better paying, more stable employment that provided benefits and career advancement opportunities. And this comprehensive approach recognized that sustainable solutions to homelessness required addressing both immediate needs and underlying economic vulnerabilities that had created the crisis in the first place, while also providing support services that could help families navigate the transition from homelessness to stable housing without falling back into crisis when inevitable challenges arose. The housing placement that was eventually arranged involved not just paying rent and deposits, but also working with landlords and property managers to address discrimination against families with histories of homelessness, and helping the family understand tenant rights and responsibilities that could help them maintain stable housing relationships, while also connecting them with community resources and support networks that could provide assistance with budgeting, employment counseling, and other services that helped families maintain housing stability while building financial reserves and social connections that provided security against future economic disruptions. The educational support that was provided for Sofia and Miguel included not just school supplies and appropriate clothing, but also tutoring and counseling services that addressed the academic gaps and emotional trauma that had resulted from their period of homelessness. And this comprehensive approach recognized that children who had experienced housing instability needed additional support to catch up academically while processing the psychological impact of poverty and displacement that could affect their educational achievement and social development for years after their family's housing situation had stabilized. The foundation program that developed from this family's case became a comprehensive homeless prevention and intervention initiative that addressed both emergency needs and long-term stability through employment assistance, housing placement, educational support, and ongoing case management that recognized homelessness as a complex problem requiring multifaceted solutions rather than simple charity that addressed symptoms without changing underlying conditions that created vulnerability to housing loss. And the program's success was measured not just by the number of families housed, but by their long-term stability and independence that demonstrated sustainable solutions rather than temporary relief. Years later, when Diego had established a successful small business providing construction services that employed other workers who had faced similar challenges, when Carmen had completed vocational training and found stable employment with benefits and advancement opportunities, when Sofia had graduated from university with plans to become a social worker helping other families in crisis, and Miguel had become a community advocate working to prevent homelessness through policy changes and support services, Ronaldo would reflect that discovering their family under the bridge had taught him that homelessness was not a personal failure, but a systematic problem that required individual compassion combined with structural changes. That families experiencing homelessness possessed strengths and capabilities that needed support rather than judgment, and that sustainable solutions required understanding each family's unique circumstances and providing comprehensive assistance that addressed multiple challenges simultaneously, rather than focusing on single issues that ignored the complex interactions between poverty, unemployment, housing costs, and social support systems that determined whether families could achieve and maintain stability.